Okay. Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Ria. I will be moderating today's session. I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We have been conducting these monthly lectures since August, and we've gotten a great response from all the participants each month for each lecture. So, thank you very much for being here today. Uh, we are also shortly going to start lectures that are more detailed and practice oriented for teachers, practitioners, and parents. So, which will be more pedagogy specific about teaching in preschool, English, history. So, do keep a lookout for those lectures in your inbox in December and January. Uh, Thank you again for joining for today's lecture series. This month's lecture series is The Politics of Childhood. This is the second edition in the Politics of Childhood series. Last month, we conducted two lectures on the influence on our ideas of childhood from history of India and Hinduism. And these series lectures are on influence of Islam and Christianity, respectively, on our ideas of education as well as childhood. So our topic today for today's lecture is Islam, Education and the Child. Professor Nita Kumar will talk about the ideas of the child in Islam and how various practices and beliefs in Islam have influenced our understanding of the child, their childhood, their education, or especially the origins of how and where it started. She will also talk about positions of various Islamic thinkers and schooling and curriculum in present-day madrasas, especially in view of current debates that are going on. Before the lecture begins, I would like to, just give you all a few introductions about the organization that is organizing this and also about our speaker today. NIRMAN is a not-for-profit organization based out of Varanasi in India. We work in the Varanasi city and 12 adjoining villages. This is the 30th functioning year of NIRMAN in the fields of education, arts, and research. We run two innovative schools called Vidyasham, the South Point School. One is in the city and one is in the adjoining village of Deoband, which is 12 kilometers away from the city. And it's an inclusive school. So we have students from families of farmers, weavers, daily wage workers, entrepreneurs, researchers, everyone sitting together, working together, learning together. We also have a research wing called the Center of Post-Colonial Education. So we host study abroad programs and students. And this lecture series is part of the research wing as well, because one of the main aims is to advance dialogue in education. Our third important aspect of NIRMAN is the artist studio. So we used to, pre-COVID times, we used to have a lot of artists constantly visiting. We used to have a lot of events constantly happening in our school campuses. And now a little bit about our speaker today. She's known to me as Nita ma'am. Most of us at NIRMAN call her Nita ma'am. Otherwise, she was a Professor Kumar. She completed her Ph.D. from University of Chicago. Fields of research have been history of modern India, European and Russian history, as well as anthropology. She's written multiple books, research papers, and the list is really long. And mainly, she's the founder and director at NIRMAN. So for the past 30 years, she's taught and written curricula and trained teachers and worked with on children's book projects as well as a lot of art projects. So we also train external organizations and their teachers. So we've had teachers from various DLED groups in India and abroad who have come to us, and received training earlier. And before I spend too much time in the introductions, I would now like to invite Nita ma'am to give an introduction for today's lecture.
All right. Okay. So let me say hello to everyone from my side and welcome you, just as Ria has done. We are going to talk about a completely new topic. We haven't touched on it so far. We've covered all kinds of things such as the family and the school relationship and the child in history and the child and this and English teaching and, so on and so forth, the preschool child, 3 years, 4 years old, etc. But now today, what I want to do is to talk about what Islamic philosophy and practice does with the child and with education. Let me begin with my credentials, so you all know what is happening with your speaker and how she is equipped to talk about this. I have grown up in a family which was, I suppose, in retrospect, very Islamicized. So a Hindu family which had a very Islamic kind of socialization process, so that when I grew up, I had lots and lots of Muslim friends and peers and so on. And it never even struck me that they were any different to us. Our lifestyle and their lifestyles was very similar. And I write blogs on all kinds of topics, such as everyday life in India and my own life and times and education and the politics of everything. And in one of the blogs, I have mentioned that the only difference really between some Muslim friends' home and my own was that in their house, I noticed that there was a pikdan, which is a spittoon, in every room practically. And the same was true of us. But the difference was that in their family, the grandmother used it, not the men. And in our family, it was the men who used it. So a little thing like that is all that struck me as different between my Muslim friends and myself. So, you can talk about that. You can think of that as a kind of grounds or a credential for my talk today. I am profoundly influenced by my Islamicized upbringing. I have grown up thinking of Hindus and Muslims as one, not to mention Christians and Jews and Parsis and so on. But I had to face the fact as an adult, decades later, that there was indeed some kind of a rift in our nation between these two communities that had been treated by me innocently and completely sociologically soundly as one, including in language and food and lifestyle and attitudes and so on. So this rift was a kind of intellectual challenge for me, which I have striven then to meet in research. So the research that I conducted has been mostly in the city of Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh. And that is fine because Varanasi may be a pilgrimage center for the Hindus and all that. It has a very large number of Muslims. Banaras or Varanasi is famous for its silk weaving. And the silk industry, the weaving industry, is mostly in the hands of Muslim weavers, so called Ansaris. So I spent a lot of years or decades working with the Ansaris of Banaras. And the result is that not only do I have a handle on Islam, I have it in a very specialized way, which is Islam in the popular sense, Islam as practiced on the ground in India. My knowledge, therefore, my expertise is not in classical Islam or textual Islam. And to tell you the truth, I don't know Turkish or Persian, and I have only 1 year of Arabic, so that's also spotty. Urdu I'm fluent in. So my research credentials have to do with Islam on the ground. And there are, of course, contextualizations that I like to make with classical Islam. But mostly what I know about Islam is from my informants, from my research sites, from my archival data about the practice of Islam. And the third kind of credential which I have is in running this school and organization that Ria mentioned. The school is called Vidyashram, the South Point in Banaras. The organization is called NIRMAN. And we have right from the beginning been extremely integrated, not only in terms of class, but in terms of religious and sectarian community. So we have a lot of Muslim children, a lot of weavers' children, and other kinds of artisans' children and Muslims' children in our schools, both the campuses. And because of that, I have a 30-year-old association with children of weavers and other Muslim communities, and of course their guardians, therefore. So I know the families as well as the students in our school. That is a very rich source of data. And I will not, therefore, bend to anyone in my knowledge of what Muslims think of children and how they behave and treat children and think of childhood. Given that kind of little introduction of myself, let me move on. And what I want to do in today's lecture is talk about Islam and Islamic ideas of childhood and education in three parts: pre-colonial, colonial, and then contemporary or post-colonial. And in each case, although I will be seemingly talking mostly about education, I'm going to try to link it with ideas of children and childhood. And at the end, we'll look at the situation just of children and childhood in itself. Okay? So now, as most of you must know, Islam in India goes back a long way. Muslims came to South Asia soon after the death of the Prophet in 632 CE, first with Arab traders in the Malabar and Konkan regions, and then with other traders and also settlers in the Sindh area and northwest India. They settled down, they integrated, they built their mosques, they even started schools, and they became part of the Indian population. So that's already from the 7th, 8th centuries onwards. And then in the 13th century, approximately, we started having various Islamic dynasties of people founded by people who came from mostly Turkey and Afghanistan and Central Asia, and of diverse ethnicities. So one of the points that I want to make right at the outset is about the diversity of the group, who are all called Muslims. Muslims are not one kind of people who can be categorized by just that term. They themselves differentiate among themselves in various ways. And right away, we see that we have people coming from various parts of Europe and Asia, so they already call themselves and should be therefore called justly by their ethnic origins as Turkish or Uzbeks or Afghans and so on. And starting right away with the Arabs, with Persians, the most important category, finally. So the thing that we mostly know, apart from the Delhi Sultanate and even a rough knowledge of Indian history, is about the Mughals. The Mughal dynasty set up by Babur in the early 16th century, and with 5 or 6 great Mughals to follow, ending after Aurangzeb in 1707. All right, so this is sort of the Islamic period, if you want to call it, by a periodization which is sometimes challenged by historians, but the justification of it is what I just described, that there were all these Islamic dynasties. Now, any dynasty or rule or society wants to perpetuate itself by teaching along its own theoretical and ideological lines, right? And that's what happened in the case of Islam in South Asia. So right from the beginning, we have the setting up of something called the madarsa. And the madarsa is just a word which could be translated as school. And interestingly, not even school in our sense or the British sense, but in the American sense, where the Americans, and I used to laugh at that until I've made this connection, use school in the sense of university as well. So any place of teaching and learning is a school, right? From your preschool and nursery school up to the highest echelons of higher education. That's what madrasa means. It could be for literacy, it could be for very, very young children, or it could be for higher studies. And there is sometimes a dispute about that this is not really a madrasa because it doesn't do that. But okay, let's just take it for the largest possible interpretation. A madrasa is a school in which some kind of learning or teaching is going on. So it was started on the Indian subcontinent as early as the first people who came, which is, as I said, the 7th, 8th centuries, but perhaps it got entrenched more in the 10th or 11th centuries. That's the beginnings of it. I want to discuss the curriculum now. What kind of things are taught in a madrasa? At the heart of Islamic civilization, as we all know, is the sacred text of the Quran Sharif, followed by the Hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the recorded sayings. The Hadith is something that has to be researched and then closely transcribed and documented. It's not easy to come by Hadith, but once it's there, that's one of the foundations of Islamic learning. So the Quran, as we know, is the literal word of God. It was received orally by the Prophet over a course of 22 years. The word itself means recitation. And so Muslims the world over commit parts of it to memory and have done so since the birth of Islam. And that's the best way to master it and to come to terms with what is the Quran and what is Islam. The orality of this original text has led to what we may call the logocentrism of the Islamic tradition. Logocentrism is a philosophy that privileges speech over writing, because the former, that is speech, is closer to an originating transcendental source. Only when you can master it verbally and repeat it verbatim are you close enough, satisfactorily close enough to the actual original. That's why memorization and recitation of the Quran is continues to be the bedrock of the Islamic learned tradition. Children begin this education at the age of 4 or 5, ideally speaking, in a Quran school with anyone who already knows it, who knows the Quran in Arabic, and they have to memorize select verses according to the dictates of the teacher, and then under the direction of this teacher, they keep repeating and reciting until they get it down pat. People, much later, who memorize the entire Quran are known as Hafiz, literally one who protects the tradition from neglect or change or corruption. This point is important because when in our modern mindset, we hear of or we observe children repeating things by rote. Children have memorized something and they are now seemingly regurgitating it without any comprehension of it. We may get a little put off. And I myself, as a researcher, have observed countless times children just reading and repeating, reciting it, repeating and reciting. And I thought to myself, oh my God, what is this? Aren't they ever going to be explained anything? Aren't they going to understand what's behind it? And I've tried to question this many times until finally I've understood that the procedure is a perfectly developed one. The idea is that you have to first commit it to memory. And you do it at an age where you cannot understand the ideas behind it. You just have to commit it to memory. And then afterwards, you are going to be able to sift through and follow other subjects which fall into another category that I'll mention right now, of sciences, including grammar, rhetoric, logic, jurisprudence, and so on. And they will then be able to understand what is being taught to them, having first committed it to memory. So now we have this kind of rote learning. And if you think about it, it's very similar. It's almost the same as the idea in other traditions. So the Vedas have to be learned by rote because you have to pass them on very accurately, and the written one doesn't do it. You have to be able to recite them in different kinds of traditions of recitation, exactly as you are guided to. And even with the Vedas, you are never explained. You have to learn them for several years, and then comes other kinds of cross-question and explanation. So the curriculum consisted of 2 kinds of subjects, and they are divided into the mankulat, which was in Arabic. They are the transmitted or transcribed subjects, transmitted and transcribed from the Quran. And they consist mostly of the Quran and the Hadith, as I just said. And the other category of subjects are the makulat, or the rational sciences, which include grammar, rhetoric, logic, jurisprudence, and these were taught in both Arabic and Persian. So the idea in this kind of studying is to master one book at a time. You master a book from one particular teacher, and you get a kind of certificate from that teacher of now being in a position to yourself teach that book to someone else. And the test of a scholar was how many books that scholar completes and with whom, under whom. The Quran, therefore, the curriculum, therefore, comes to include the Quran, Hadith, the Prophet's biography, fiqh or jurisprudence, and the language of Arabic, together with all these rational subjects of rhetoric, logic, and so on. However, this was never the only kind of curriculum. This was not the only kind of learning and teaching. There is what we may call an alternative curriculum right from the beginning in Islam. And this consists of the transmission of ideas and knowledge carried on by the Sufis. And the Sufis the term may be translated as mystics. That's usually done in English. Sometimes they're just called fakirs, sometimes saints. They are ascetics. That's how I like to think of them. And the knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, which is the domain of the Sufis, and this other body of knowledge, which I just described, which is the domain of the learned people called ulama, from the singular alim. So these two kinds of people and two kinds of learning could overlap, and the same person could first study in a madrasa and be completely proficient in all that body of knowledge, but also have a Sufi teacher and learn the kind of emotionally inspired and mystically charged kind of knowledge of the Sufis. So there is a separation, and I did call it the formal curriculum and a more informal or alternative curriculum for various reasons, which I'll get into. But there can definitely be an overlap, and there was. So the Sultanate period saw the advent of the Sufis. They came from the Middle East, as did Islam, and they spread all over South Asia. Then in the Mughal period, you have a burgeoning further. So over all of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, therefore South Asia, there is a huge, wonderful kind of archaeological and structural display of Sufi culture and of the Sufis' knowledge and reach. Let's just get into it a little bit more. The essence of this is what we would call pre-modern. The actual way in which it was done in pre-colonial times does not exist anywhere right now. We have vestiges of it, and I'll describe those for right now. But originally, how it was is that you went to study first the basics with a family member or a neighbor, the Quran itself, and then you attached yourself to a teacher. You went physically to the teacher's home or the kind of seminary or retreat that they had called the Khanka. And there you lived and learned. The teacher took no fees, but expected service and gifts and so on. And this kind of curriculum and the pace of study could take as long as was needed by the student, leading ultimately to their graduation at the end of the course of study. So the role of these Sufis was tremendous. So while the actual emperors or sultans or different rulers exercised political authority, moral authority vested in these holy men and religious scholars. And they were unparalleled in their authority, that it even surpassed that of the Muslim sultans and emperors, who could often be considered merely worldly, and they were in fact worldly. They were astute political people, leaders, who could go to any extents and discard any tenets of Islam if it suited their political purpose. So there was a reason for this kind of authority. One other kind of curriculum that deserves mention is called Dars-e-Nizami. And this was centered in the city of Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh, UP. So in the 17th century, a school emerged in Lucknow in a location called the Firangi Mahal. And it was not a school in the formal sense, it was just a set of homes where an extended family lived, an extended family of teachers, and different students would come and study with different members of this family. But the school was extremely influential, and it trained all the officers, the qazis and the muftis and so on, for the Mughal court and for the Awadh court of Lucknow, centered in Lucknow, which followed on Mughal rule. It also produced numerous scholars who wrote excellent treatises in Arabic and Persian, did research and interpretation on all the branches of Islamic knowledge and published and taught, and they had immense, long-lasting contribution all over South Asia. This is the curriculum that often came to dominate Islamic education in the Islamic institutions of South Asia. And this school, interestingly, used that same combination which I mentioned of mystical learning from the Sufis on the one hand, and legal studies and classical studies useful for official employment on the other hand, and the rational sciences. Okay, so let's look at the colonial period. So much for the pre-colonial. And just to quickly summarize, one of the 2 or 3 of the main points that I made is, first, that there's a lot of diversity. There are already, you see, different kinds of learning patterns, different kinds of curricula. There are different kinds of ethnic groups who have come originally. And the second point I've made is that oral learning and oral transmission is not just a mistake they're making. It's not something that they are failing to do, but a very well-developed style and approach and philosophy of learning. And that there is a whole body of knowledge within Islam that consists of the rational sciences. There is mystical learning, there is the classical learning based in the Quran and Hadith, and then there is the rational sciences. All right, so in the colonial period, it's very interesting, Islam in its educational mode breaks up into at least 3 main sects. And these are called maslaks, or schools of thought. They are the Deobandi, the Barelvi, and the Ahle Hadith, each with their own madrasas, their own curriculum, their own publications, and their own kinds of graduates. So there is something which is in common. Now they are different, they have different, as I told you, institutions and curricula and so on. But what is in common is that they are not regarded as modern. In the colonial period, there is a new kind of typecasting which we have to take very seriously. So Islam was not the same in the pre-colonial as it came to be in the colonial period. It is in the colonial period that it is characterized as anything they do as religious. So their teaching becomes religious teaching. A madrasa becomes a religious school. And religious, by definition in the colonial period, is not modern or scientific. So even if the Islamic core of knowledge consisted of sciences, and they were very proud of their scientific approach and their scientific transmission of knowledge, this is not the thing that is carried on in the colonial period, and you have the opposite rather. So on the one hand is modern education, progressive education. On the other hand is the education of the madrasas, which now is signified as traditional and religious. So this is in common in all 3 of them. The first one is the Deobandi one. It comes from the name of the town of Deoband, which is outside Delhi in western UP. So Deoband was all 3 are reformist movements. That is, they're trying to react and respond to the challenge of colonialism as to what is wrong in South Asia. The British, when they began to rule and acquired power in South Asia, had to somehow inferiorize and belittle whatever was there in front of them and its history. So the immediate history was an Islamic history because they were the ones who took over from the Mughals. And Islam was, there was already a long history of antagonism between Islam and Christianity. But even if it's not the Christians as such, but some kind of a new nationalist British rule in India, they are Christian enough to find that Muslims can be regarded as enemies. And so the Muslims had a challenge in front of them, which is met in diverse ways. But one of the ways was through the founding of this school at Deoband. And I'm deliberately not going into the histories of each of the schools with their founders and all that. It'll be just a bunch of names for you. I can, recommend the readings. There's been wonderful research done on each one in itself. And if you don't want to look at a whole tome, a whole book, there are little articles, there are other entries and encyclopedias and so on. And, you know, it's from this that Wikipedia exists. So just as a little tangent, if you do look up any of these things on Wikipedia, yes, it's going to be fine. Yes, it's going to have its limitations. It's fine because it's all based on academic research, finally, somewhere or the other. You can tell from the footnotes. It has its limitations because people can't handle too much of that academic stuff, so they always cut corners, draw lines, and then they resort also to journalism and other kinds of popular sources. So it's always mixed. However, by and large, it's fine for an introduction. So you can look up who founded Deoband, when it was founded, etc., etc. The point really is, what did it strive to do? So here's the key thing. It seems to be a religious institution. It seems to be traditional. But according to scholars, according to my own interpretation, it's actually a modern school. And it's modern because it took on very responsibly the challenge of producing at that time, in the middle of the 19th century, a response to the colonial challenge of how Islam could be seen as viable and rational and so on, how Islam could be defended. So it consists, its curriculum, its teaching consists of, again, a synthesis of the law of Islam, classical Islam, and the path, which means Sufism. So the Deobandi person, student, and therefore graduate, was expected to abandon superficial customs, to fulfill all religious obligations, to submit themselves to guidance in all aspects of their life. But basically, they have the work, the goal is the creation of personally responsible Muslims who are ethically very, very upright in character. They hold themselves to high moral ideals and codes of conduct. And the two terms which are relevant here is adab, which means moral or ideal code of conduct, adab, and refinement, which is to be sharif, or the abstract noun sharafat. Adab and sharafat, those became the goals of the new educated Muslim in the 19th century, in the colonial period. The second school that was set up was also in Western UP, in the town of Bareilly, and is called Bareilwi. So the first is named after its town called Deobandi, the second is named after its town called Bareilwi. These are both Sunni maslaks or schools. So the Bareilwi is regarded as a little looser and more casual than the Deobandi. And they, when they have occasion to differ from each other, although to outsiders it seems that both of them have the same kind of synthesis which I just described between law, classical law, and the Sufi path. Between them, it would seem that the Deobandis are stricter and the Bareilwis are looser, and the Bareilwis are criticized by the Deobandis and others for permitting their followers to participate more in the common customs and practices of South Asia. Many of them are supposedly the influence of Hinduism. I'll mention that a little bit more in a minute. Let me just quickly cover the third school, which is very influential, and that's called Ahle Hadith. So I've talked about Hadith already. It's the sayings of the Prophet. Ahle Hadith means to stick, to go back. It's a fundamentalist kind of approach. It says we have to go back to the original sayings of the Prophet. And so this encourages a tendency towards literalism, a lot of quibbling about what actually was the saying or what was not. The focus is a lot on ritual, how to perform your prayers and say your namaz and so on. It's also millenarian. That means that there is a kind of urgency to the teachings that we have to reach some place in some time in a certain way. So when I look at my own research site of Banaras, I find there is a range of madarsas in Banaras, many more than one would suspect. I myself have studied at least 30 or 40, and they are divided between these three sects. Some are Deobandi madarsas, some are Bareilwi madarsas, And the most impressive ones, including a whole university, Jamia Salfia, are Ahle Hadith madrasas. Now, the Deobandi ones consist of teachers who were graduates from Deoband. The Barelvi ones consist of teachers who have graduated from their own seminaries. There is no institution for the Ahle Hadith, but that doesn't matter. They have founded new institutions, such as the one I mentioned, Jamia Salfia, back in 1966, because they have this kind of acute need. Some people have this acute need for going back still further into the echelons of Quranic knowledge. And at the same time, the synthesis remains. They have to meet the demands of modern times. Okay, so now let's come to the present day. What is happening? I've mentioned the present day already when I talked about these madrasas today in Banaras. But basically, we still have to answer a couple of questions before we move on further. One is the high number of Muslims in South Asia, because the debate, politically speaking, which has appeared, which we should confront head on, is where did all the Muslims come from? So we know that a certain number were migrants from, as I said, Turkey, Afghanistan, Persia, Arabia, and so on. But the majority, vast majority, are converts. So ethnically, they are the same as the whole population of South Asia. They just happen to have a different understanding of value, truth, ethics, and morality. The question about the conversion of Islam is very close to our interest in education. The process of education, when I was describing the curriculum, does not always consist of just one formal curriculum in a formal kind of designated space, which we may call school, madrasa, whatever. The process of education could take place in the fields, in the cities and villages, in neighborhoods, in homes, verandas, rooftops, whatever. Now that's where the Sufis reappear again in our discussion. Regardless of which part of South Asia we look at, first of all, architecturally, you'll find the Muslim presence, not only in mosques, but in Sufi shrines. Everywhere there are dargahs and khanqahs and other kinds of centers. Usually it consists of the tomb of a saint or a holy man, and then it gets built up around it into sometimes dazzlingly beautiful buildings and structures. They are still simple, but they are unquestionably Islamic. There is something about the architecture which has been in continuation over the centuries, and it is very pervasive. So there's no question that this is part of our geography and our built-up scene in South Asia. What happens at these dargahs? So since they're the tomb shrines of saints, people are tempted, people are drawn to visit them. I have compared it because I was making this comparison between popular Islam and popular Hinduism to the identical same practices of Hindus. And incidentally, Hindus visit these Sufi shrines all the time, even if the reverse is not true. So Muslims, go to temples, Hindu temples. I know Muslims who hang around them and who perform various services for them. That's different. But these Sufi shrines are seen somehow as much more open and hospitable to all kinds of people. And they have the attractiveness of being able to be mediators. So they could take your problem to the highest authorities, whatever you imagine that to be, and help in resolving those problems. I feel pretty sure that all of you must have seen one of these shrines or dargahs of saints. Usually you have a lattice work and there are red threads tied to it, or there may be trees with threads tied, sometimes messages, prayer messages, folded pieces of paper. You see a lot of people hanging around, camping around sometimes. They've come with their little picnic baskets. They sit there eating and drinking. This kind of understanding of what that place can give you makes us want to talk about Sufism as a whole educational venture in South Asia. Historically, the answer to the question which I posed is how there came to be so many conversions to Islam in South Asia. The answer lies in the influence of the Sufi preachers and saints. Not only did they traverse sometimes very remote tracts of the country, such as in Northeast and East Bengal and the Northeast of India and in the Deccan and so on, they had huge humanitarian impulses which really hit a chord with people. So they were interested in farming, in livestock, in whatever it was that was going on in the villages. They addressed everyday problems of people. They talked in their languages, not in some high Arabic or foreign language. And very often, they were very talented in narration, charismatic people who could present their things in storytelling form or in sometimes in verse or even in music. All of this has led to a little bit of an intangible effect where the actual Sufi schools are not known. There are quite a few Sufi schools, but the place, the dargah, is the charismatic thing which draws a lot of visitors. So we know the Chishti one, we know the Nizamuddin one in Delhi and in Ajmer, but every city, and especially in North India, which is what I'm familiar with, but I'm almost sure the same is true of Central and South India, every city and village has beautiful dargahs where people congregate on certain days of the week. And then there's an Urz ceremony, which is at a fixed time, maybe once a year or oftener. And at that time, that place is vibrant for 2 or 3 days with a lot of singing, a lot of listening to preaching, lights, music, sound, food, whatever you think is a popular way of approaching a divine presence. All of this is the target of attack by reformist Muslim leaders. So we have a very viable kind of teaching going on at these dargahs, but it's not always looked on very positively by those who would rather have teaching within a formal setup. So today what is happening? Today there are, I would say, 3 tendencies. One is that madrasas in India are certainly not some kind of a hive for terrorism. They're certainly not alternative or marginalized or different. According to my analysis, madrasas are the same at the primary level as primary schools, at the high school level as other secondary and higher secondary schools. They also are affiliated to boards. First of all, they're extremely numerous. So in UP alone, you have 20 to 30,000, some say even 50,000 madrasas, of which at least half are affiliated. The others are private, and I'm sure they're seeking affiliation at some point. If you visit them, they have very regular school buildings, they have trained teachers, they have set courses of study. Those courses of study include English and Hindi and math and the social studies and computer science and so on. They differ maybe in the uniforms that the children wear. In the madrasas, I think the uniforms still continues to be kurta pajama and a little cap, a skull cap. That differentiates them. Not in the higher classes, I think, but at least in all the junior classes. And so visually, it strikes you as different. Now there is a segregation, so that although earlier the term madrasa just meant school, since now it means Islamic school or religious school, there are no non-Muslims in the madrasa. The point I'm trying to make is that they are just like schools. If you want to understand what is an Islamic view of education, I have told you what was an Islamic view of education, but modern day education for Muslims in a madrasa is a kind of accretion. That means they have all the subjects which other schools and other students have. They also have on top of it Urdu and Arabic and the Quran up to a few years. They don't follow it after that unless the student opts to go in for clerical training. And for clerical training, in order to be a preacher or a teacher or some religious leader, there are other madrasas. So in a regular madrasa school, you would just do your high school, you would do your class 10, you would do your class 12, and then you would graduate with the same kind of degree as from some other school. However, there must be a difference in the ideas of children in childhood. So let's explore that a tiny bit more. 4 or 5 things. The first is that in Islam, just like in Hinduism, there is no very articulate discourse of childhood. Childhood itself is a very novel thing, historically speaking. It characterizes only modern times. And in pre-modern times, no one, including Europeans, had an idea of the child. So just as in Europe and in the Western world, there was a continuity or fluidity of age, and you continued to be a toddler and then a child, then an adolescent and an adult, without any breakups like at this age, this is what happens, and this is teenage and so on. Just the same way, in both Hinduism and Islam, there is a continuity. There is no separation of childhood from other ages. Now, from a modern perspective, you can do a lot. You could be extremely critical. You could be mostly critical of the fact that since there is no idea of childhood, children are sometimes treated abusively. They are made to work, they are made to study things which are not appropriate for them. They may be married. There was child marriage in every single culture in the world, and there was a lot of child marriage in Islam. Sometimes these things continue in modern times, but they are targets of reform, publicly, privately, officially, and unofficially. No one is proud of it. No one is trying to save it or hold on to it for the most part. So this is one idea of childhood. And the other is that together with this is that of hierarchy. So I mentioned the 2 concepts, and I spoke of them very positively, adab and sharafat. But if you explore them further, so if adab means a kind of etiquette, knowing your ethical behavior pattern, your ethical code, who is dictating that? Of course, it means, finally, to stay in your place, to be correct to your position, to not challenge those who are your seniors or in positions of authority over you. That's what adab is. And if it's very gendered. So if you explore particularly what it means for girls, it really means looking down, with modesty. Modesty is a big thing. Sharam, or being well behaved, fulfilling all your obligations, especially to your elders, your duties, both in the household. That's what adab is. So when it applies to children, it's a very disciplinarian system. If you visit a Muslim home, an ordinary Muslim home, you'll see children being treated the same way as in every home. Some of them are being spoiled, they're running amok. They're not actually being disciplined very much. But suddenly at a certain age, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, 6, definitely by 6 or 7, the discipline does set in, and they're expected, if they're girls, to already cover their heads, if they're boys, to behave and speak and react in certain ways. So this is all disguised under the terms of etiquette and being within the bounds of your position, right? Now, this expansive concept of adab centers around the acceptance of hierarchy, right? And hierarchy has both a religious and a social dimension. In religious terms, it entails acknowledgement of the oneness of God. No questioning that. And you must faithfully perform the daily and periodic duties of prayer, fasting, etc., as enjoined by the Sharia. In social terms, it means something gendered. For women or girls, it means abiding by the hierarchies of gender. For boys and men, it means abiding by the hierarchies of age. Okay? Everyone must know their own position. The next idea about children would be, I would say, completely class-centered. My research has been in the lower classes, working classes. Weavers are that, artisans are that. And I was appalled to find what low value people put on education. If the child can study, fine. If they don't have time because they're already working at home, that's fine too. If they show any inclination to sit and study, good. But if not, very good as well. So there's a kind of nonchalance, a kind of distancing from modern education. This has two reasons. I mentioned class, but let me expand on that. The first is that the nature of our education in modern times is pretty useless. If we could actually deliver the goods, if we could make this useless liberal education be at least good for something in the future in terms of the career path or the life satisfaction of the student, then people would be reasonable enough to seek it and want it. It doesn't do that. Children who graduate from school are still not competent to go in for something higher and are still not able to enter other courses of learning. Everything is so damn competitive. And even if they were to do that, there's no guarantee of any kind of job. Whereas weaving, artisans' jobs, etc., are a form of business or entrepreneurship. If you work hard, you're going to succeed. But education is very deceptive. It promises something and it doesn't deliver it. So they are a bit aloof from that for that reason. And this, of course, reflects on the nature of our nation state. The state is weak. It is supposed to give universal education to everyone. Because education is so faulty, people are turned off from it, not only Muslims, Hindus as well. So maybe the figures are higher, but that is all a reflection of the number of working classes or lower class people in that community. It's a class issue and not a religious issue. Islam has forever been dedicated to the pursuit of learning and education. It really rates education and knowledge very high. Ilm is the highest thing, and you can go around the globe searching for it, and you should. And you know that lots and lots of Muslims throughout history have been fabled for their knowledge and their production of the sciences. So this kind of understanding of Islam as being anti-something is based on a colonial kind of split. Let me expand on something that I already mentioned. According to the reading of the colonial period, which continues into modern times, there is something called tradition and there's something called modernity. And Islamic education is looked upon, madrasa education is looked upon as traditional and not modern. However, in their view, each effort, such as the ones I described, is characterized by its own version of the best balance between continuity and change, between the fundamentals of their belief system and reform, between the dini or spiritual and the dunyai or worldly, right? So, for instance, one institution founded in 1941, which runs a madrasa, it's called Jamaat-e-Islami. It advertises itself as having kept pace with modern education. The 4,000 plus students who study here come from across the country and are taught subjects like personality development, economics, political science, home science, as well as Islamic education. I think every single Islamic institution would claim that they are making a synthesis to the best, in the best possible way, between what is important for Islam and what is important in modernity. Let me end by talking a little bit about girls and girls' education. And a very interesting and important text here is called Bihishti Zevar, translated as Heavenly Jewels by Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, died 1943. So Bihishti Zevar is like a textbook for girls. And for the longest time, it's something that was the only text they studied, and it was something that was gifted to every bride at her wedding. And it consists of the whole subtle as well as pervasive impact of adab, which I mentioned. So all kinds of rules, from the most detailed ones about what to cook, how to cook, but what medicine to give, how to give it, the rules regarding body, the bodily discipline, behavior, hostessing, everything to run the household efficiently, to be a very good role model as a wife and mother and sister-in-law and daughter-in-law and so on, to raise well-behaved children, to fulfill all the obligations with everyone with whom there are ties. So this kind of world which was created for girls is, of course, a very, very restrictive one, very restrictive. So throughout, there has been gender inequality, which is not, again, any different to that in other communities. But since we're talking about Islam, it bears mention and it bears emphasis. So talking about ideas of children, we must understand that they are highly gendered ideas. All the reform and progressivism which was put in place, for example, Syed Ahmad Khan, in his founding of what has now become I'm sorry, why am I blanking out? Aligarh Muslim University, was all for men. It was all for males. The whole point was Syed Ahmad Khan is a perfect example of gendered inequality. He had a very powerful, dynamic mother who taught him a lot privately at home. And she was so successful that all he could think was, well, that everyone should be like my mother. They'll be perfectly fine living at home, being a good mother, learning privately and teaching privately. Why do girls need to go to school? Why do they need that kind of formal education which boys need, right? So it's taking a long time to get over that hump. Even today, there is that inequality. And I think I'd like to conclude with this kind of a statement. There are two main points. One is about this kind of inequality, the hierarchy of both gender and age in Islam that characterizes Islam's attitude towards children. And the other thing is what happened in the colonial times when perfectly well-developed ways of teaching and learning came to be characterized as scriptural or religious and traditional and therefore backward. So somehow over the 19th and 20th centuries, even though there have been lots of efforts to becoming modern and to modernize among Muslims, there still is a characterization of everything, right from the clothing of a Muslim person who wants to be comfortable in the kurta pajama, to the wearing of the skull cap, and so on, and to the use of Urdu or to the use of Arabic. There is a tendency to characterize all this as somehow traditional and backward. This has colonial roots. That's what I'm trying to say. It is nothing that is essential to this Islamic practice, and therefore it's not essential for us to continue it if we don't want to.
I'll quickly jump to the questions. So two questions that are in connection to what you just ended with saying was that first one being that how does the issue that you made about the diversified Muslim identity, whether this diversified identity also affects patterns of education, this being one, and in connection to that, not exactly the same, but something similar, is that how are different occupational Muslim communities like weavers responding to textual education, whether their profession and their socialization has a kind of hurdle to the spread of education within their community. So start with that, and then I'll end with one more question.
Okay, so regarding diversity, it's very healthy to have diversity, and present day trends, not within Islam actually so much as within Hinduism, to try to unify all kinds of diverse ways of practice and belief and give it one name, one category, one definition, and therefore one correct way of doing something, are dangerous and they are bad. They are simplifying things which are interestingly complex, historically complex, and they were imaginative, culturally rich, and satisfying to people. So the diversity of Islam is a healthy thing. How it affects education is that people always build separate institutions. You'll find it very difficult to characterize an Islamic institution as Islamic and then leave it at that. You'll have to say which kind of legal school of thought does it follow, who was its founder, and what was the origins of the founder, which school did the founder come from, right? So is it a Deobandi or Ahle Hadith kind of institution? These kinds of differences make for a huge diversity. As you might hear if you listen to my talk tomorrow, the same is true of Christianity. You have Anglicans, Methodists, evangelicals, the list goes on. And you, from the outside, only from a distant outside, it all looks one. And you think, okay, can't they make up their minds? If it's Muslim, it should be Muslim. No, they can't actually make up their minds. And the differences are there's a multitude of them. And each one seems very important internally, right? So there are diverse institutions who do not get along in the same city or in the same village. Yeah, that's what the result of the diversity means. Weaver's response to education could have changed, except that there is a huge economic setback. And weavers, along with many other working classes, have become relatively weak at present and have lost their rootedness in their own occupation. They are having to leave the weaving occupation and choose other things because they are in such economic trouble. But the trend that was occurring was that they were trying very hard to take up the challenge of modernity and having their children work at the loom from not such a young age as was typical, but from a later age, to postpone their sitting at the loom and rather send them to a school or madrasa. So they were trying that, but it was not getting them anywhere. There are not enough examples of graduates from schools among weavers who can be a role model for other weaving children. So Ansaris or weavers in Banaras, like I'm sure in other places, are very skeptical of modern education. And they would rather just have this little bit of Quranic teaching and then have their children learn to do something which is professionally useful, such as weaving or some other job. It's a very sad story because it deprives the child of their childhood, if you want to look at it that way. But the solution is not to force them. Don't call it child labor and force them to go to schools. The solution is only to improve the schools and to make them maybe also have a vocational component so that the weavers and other people like them get some real satisfaction from the schooling.
All right. Last two questions. One is still in connection to what you already answered. Maybe you can shed some more insights on it. Sapna asks, I would like your insights into the factor that we can attribute to deteriorating educational status of Indian Muslims post-independence. And this is just my personal question I'm adding on to this particular question about the current debate of madrasa and their curriculum, the central government trying to mainstream them into the NCRT's curriculum, but there has been a debate that it does not align because of the religious differences. So how would you answer that? And last one being that how does the shift or difference in textual Islam and practiced Islam affect a child's education? If you would like a bit more clarification, I could ask the person who has asked the question to clarify.
Okay, let me just answer the other two questions first. Maybe you can ask and she can type something. So about the mainstreaming that's going on at present. Anything, if it comes from the top down, is something you could try to resist. Yeah, if it comes from outside and the top down. Very seldom is it meant in the right way. It's not really meant to help or reform the community. For that, the reforms should be internal. They should be from within the community. So you have to look carefully to see which Muslim leaders are reacting in which way to this. Here's again the diversity of Islam. Some are in favor and some are questioning these things. I would say that already, as I mentioned, the trend was for madrasas to be more mainstream schools. They're already going in that direction. They want to be able to offer their students the same kind of scholarship, the same kind of studying opportunities, the same kind of level at graduation as do the other schools in which people could go. So it's not a very new thing unless there is more interference in something else, because the madrasa could still have freedom, apart from offering all these subjects, to teach something else that it wanted. And it does do that already. Sometimes madrasas teach an absurd number of subjects. They have all the usual subjects, which may be 7 or 8 or 9. And then they have Urdu and Arabic and Islamic studies and so on, right? So, you know, that has to be played around with a bit pedagogically. And there has to be a pedagogical voice in this. It's not just about politics. It's about what is reasonable to have a child study and learn. And I think there's already an overloading at an early age. So this mainstreaming is not just about politics, it's also about pedagogy. What are you going to achieve in terms of the rational expectations from a child? Yeah, then about the maybe possible split in a child's experience between what classical Islam proposes and what popular or folk Islam, yeah? I think just as I was trying to suggest that there is a synthesis of both these things in the experience of institutions. There is a synthesis of both these things in the experience of individual Muslims. With some exceptions, I know there are some Muslims who are extremely conservative and text-bound. They don't like anything to do with music and dance and performance or any kind of festival, celebration, lights, sound, etc. There are Muslims like that. But the vast majority of Muslims have no problem with all this. Why? Because their own socialization and teaching has already made them comfortable with it. There's already been two parallel strands going on. One is the classical text-based Islam, which they respect and they value highly. And they are able, through various kinds of articulations of various kinds of leaders over the centuries, they're able to synthesize this with a more popular practice of Islam, which says it's all right to sing a qawwali or to listen to it. It's all right to celebrate a wedding with a barat and with lights, and it's okay to sing and have poetry writing, etc., etc., etc. They have different ways of expressing this synthesis, but they're all able to do it for the most part.
And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See
right.
you.
Oh,
again.
okay. Sorry, that was Rachita, and I think she just said that you answered her question without answering it today. All right, great. Okay, thank you so much.